A tragic unraveling. In the quiet town of Ellisville, Mississippi, Sheriff Harold Grayson was more than just the law. He was a pillar of the community, a trusted figure known for his unwavering dedication to his job and the well-being of his neighbors. At 56, he had spent over 3 decades maintaining order in the close-knit town, resolving disputes, and even officiating local gatherings. His reputation as a fair, honest, and diligent sheriff had earned him respect from everyone in Jones County. Harold was a man of few words, a calm presence, and a rock for those around him. Harold's wife, Clara, had always been the vibrant contrast to her husband's reserved nature. In her early 50s, Clara was known for her warm, engaging personality, her quick wit, and her role as the heart of any social gathering. She worked as a senior accountant at Lindell Construction, one of the biggest companies in the area, and her career had become a crucial part of her identity. To most in Ellisville, Harold and Clara appeared to be the ideal couple, a perfect balance of strength and charm. Yet, like all relationships, theirs had cracks beneath the surface, hidden away from the community's prying eyes. Over the years, Harold's dedication to his job had taken a toll on their marriage. Late nights, long hours, and the pressure of his responsibilities as sheriff left little time for Clara. She often found herself alone, her once lively social life diminished by the loneliness she felt in her marriage. The warmth and companionship she'd once shared with Harold had faded, replaced by a growing chasm of silence and unmet needs. It was during one of these lonely periods that Clara met Trey Garrison, a 31-year-old project manager at Lindell Construction. Trey was young, confident, and full of ambition. He was a man who knew what he wanted and went after it with charm and charisma. Clara had noticed him when he first joined the company, but their interactions remained professional for years. However, as time went on, Trey began to seek her out for advice on work projects, small requests that soon turned into long discussions over coffee, then dinners, and eventually, late-night conversations that filled the void in her life. At first, Clara dismissed the connection she felt with Trey as mere friendship. After all, she was married to Harold, a man she respected deeply, even if their passion had faded. But Trey's attention was intoxicating. He made her feel valued, cherished in ways she hadn't felt in years. His laughter was infectious, his gaze intense, and he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams. He was everything Harold wasn't: spontaneous, attentive, and present. The line between friendship and something more blurred quickly. What began as harmless flirtation turned into something deeper, a secret affair that Clara justified to herself as a well-deserved escape from the loneliness in her marriage. Trey became her confidant, her escape from the constraints of her life with Harold. They met in secret, finding stolen moments during work trips and private dinners, always careful to avoid the watchful eyes of their small-town community. As the affair continued, Trey began to push for more. He was tired of sneaking around, tired of being hidden. He wanted Clara to leave Harold, to take their relationship to the next level. He envisioned a life where they could be together openly, without the need for lies or deception. But Clara hesitated. Despite her love for Trey, she wasn't ready to destroy the life she had built with Harold, the stability that marriage had provided, even if that stability felt hollow at times. The turning point came during the Grayson family's annual reunion, a long-standing tradition held at the family farmhouse on the outskirts of Ellisville. The event was a festive gathering where cousins, aunts, uncles, and friends from far and wide came together for a weekend of barbecues, games, and storytelling. It was a time for Harold to unwind, to put aside his badge, and enjoy the company of those he loved. This year, Clara suggested inviting Trey to the reunion, framing it as a friendly gesture to a work colleague who happened to be in town. Harold, ever the gracious host, didn't think twice about it. Trey arrived with his usual charm, blending in effortlessly with Clara's family, charming her relatives, and laughing easily with everyone he met. But to Harold, something felt different. He noticed small gestures between Clara and Trey, A shared smile, a quick touch on the arm, that seemed just a bit too intimate. At first, he brushed it off as his imagination. After all, Clara had always been warm and friendly with people. As the evening wore on, however, Harold's unease grew. He found himself watching Clara and Trey more closely, noticing the way Clara's laughter seemed a bit too frequent and her gaze lingered a little too long. It was during the bonfire that night, with the family gathered around the crackling flames, that Harold's suspicions solidified. He caught Clara and Trey standing close, their heads bent in a quiet conversation, their voices low, sharing a moment that felt far too intimate for mere acquaintances. The sight of them together, their smiles, their shared whispers, it was like a punch to Harold's gut. Anger, betrayal, and sadness surged within him, but he forced himself to stay composed. This was neither the time nor the place for a confrontation. He had built his life on control, on the ability to keep his emotions in check, even in the most challenging situations. But beneath his calm exterior, a storm was brewing. That night, lying next to Clara in their bed, Harold's mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? What had he missed? Was it possible he had been so focused on his duty to the town that he'd neglected the very woman he had vowed to love and protect? He felt a strange mix of guilt and fury, each emotion feeding off the other, growing stronger until he could barely contain the turmoil inside. In the days that followed, Harold's suspicions hardened into resolve. He needed to know the truth, and he wasn't going to sit idly by while his marriage unraveled in secrecy. His years in law enforcement had taught him the importance of patience, of gathering all the facts before taking action. So he decided to investigate, using the skills he'd honed over decades of police work to uncover the truth about Clara and Trey's relationship. It started with small things, checking Clara's phone when she left it unattended, glancing through her emails, looking for any sign of betrayal. What he found shattered him. Hidden among her messages were dozens of texts with Trey, messages that hinted at secret meetings, shared moments, and a depth of intimacy that left no doubt in his mind. Clara hadn't just betrayed him. She had built a life with another man, a life hidden in the shadows of their marriage. Harold's world crumbled. The betrayal cut deeper than he had ever thought possible. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a complete betrayal of the life they had built together, the trust they had shared. And as Harold delved deeper, he found more. Credit card receipts for hotels, dinner reservations, and thinly veiled excuses Clara had made for her absences. Every discovery was like a knife to his heart, each piece of evidence a reminder of how little he knew about the woman he had shared his life with for nearly 3 decades. But Harold wasn't ready to confront Clara just yet. He wanted to know the full extent of her betrayal, to understand just how far she had gone to keep her secrets. He began tracking her movements, following her to her late-night meetings, piecing together the life she had tried to keep hidden from him. As the days turned into weeks, Harold's obsession with the affair grew, consuming him. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and thoughts of revenge. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on his work. His deputies began to notice the change in him, his temper shorter, his demeanor more withdrawn. The once calm and composed sheriff was unraveling, his life spinning out of control as he grappled with the betrayal that had torn his world apart. One night, after another restless evening spent scrolling through Clara's messages, Harold made a decision. He couldn't hold it in any longer. He needed answers, and he needed them now. But rather than confronting Clara, he decided to confront Trey. Fueled by a mixture of rage and desperation, Harold drove to Trey's apartment late at night. The town was quiet, the streets empty as he pulled up to the modest complex where Trey lived. He sat in his car for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to say, the questions he needed answers to. When Trey answered the door, he was startled to see Harold standing there, his face shadowed in the dim light of the hallway. The air between them was thick with tension, a quiet intensity that made Trey's skin crawl. Without a word, Harold stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I know," Harold said, his voice cold, his gaze unwavering. The words hung heavy in the air, a declaration that left no room for denial. Trey's face paled, his confidence crumbling under Harold's steady glare. He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse, but Harold cut him off, his voice a low growl that left no room for argument. "How long?" With nowhere to hide, Trey admitted to everything: the late-night meetings, the stolen weekends, the promises he had made to Clara. He tried to justify it, claiming that he loved her, that he was filling a void in her life that Harold had left empty. But Harold wasn't interested in his excuses. All he wanted was the truth. As Harold left Trey's apartment that night, his mind was a storm of emotions. The confrontation had given him answers, but it had also left him with a choice, one that would determine the future of his life, his marriage, and his place in the community he had sworn to protect. The unraveling truth. After that fateful night at Trey's apartment, Sheriff Harold Grayson returned home a changed man. The confrontation with Trey had answered many of his questions, but it had also confirmed his worst fears. Clara, the woman he had loved for almost 3 decades, had been living a double life. In the quiet of his empty home, Harold wrestled with a volatile mix of betrayal, anger, and a profound sense of loss. The very foundations of his life, the steady routines, the trust he placed in those closest to him, had been shattered. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images of Clara and Trey together, laughing, holding hands, sharing moments that were supposed to belong to him alone. It wasn't just the affair that haunted him. It was the realization that his marriage had been a facade, hiding a truth too painful to acknowledge. Harold had always prided himself on his instincts, his ability to read people, to sense deception. Yet, in his own home, he had been blind. In the days following the confrontation, Harold withdrew into himself, grappling with what to do next. His deputies at the station noticed the change. He was quieter, his responses shorter, and his temper far more volatile. Small mistakes that he would normally overlook now triggered his ire, leaving the younger officers wary of his moods. Rumors began to circulate among his staff. Some suspected he was dealing with a health issue. Others thought he might be burned out, but no one dared ask him directly. At home, the tension between Harold and Clara grew palpable. Clara had no idea that Harold knew about the affair, but she could sense a shift in him. He was colder, more distant, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her uneasy. He no longer engaged in small talk at the dinner table, and when she tried to draw him into conversation, he would respond with curt answers, his eyes hard and unreadable. One evening, unable to stand the silence any longer, Clara confronted him. "Harold, what's going on with you?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "You've been acting strange for weeks. Is something wrong?" Harold looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. He felt the anger bubbling beneath his calm facade, a surge of resentment and betrayal that he struggled to contain. "Funny you should ask," he replied, his tone icy. "Maybe you're the one who should be answering that question." Clara's face paled, her eyes widening in shock. She wasn't sure if he knew, but the look in his eyes told her that something was terribly wrong. For a moment, she felt a flicker of fear, a fear she hadn't felt in years. Harold had always been a man of control, of quiet strength, but now she sensed a darkness in him, a storm that threatened to unleash itself at any moment. What do you mean?" she stammered, trying to keep her voice steady. Harold leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he fixed her with a cold, unwavering stare. "I know about you and Trey," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "I know everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her heart pounding in her chest as she struggled to process his words. She had been careful, or at least she thought she had. She had covered her tracks, created a web of lies that she believed would protect her. But now, under Harold's unflinching gaze, she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. I can explain," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Explain." Harold's laugh was cold, bitter. "Explain what? How you lied to me for 3 years. How you betrayed me with that." He couldn't even bring himself to say Trey's name. The anger within him surged, and he clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "Tell me, Clara. Tell me how you justified it. How you rationalized throwing away everything we built." Clara struggled for words, her mind racing. She could see the pain in his eyes, the fury that simmered just beneath the surface. She felt a pang of guilt, a shame that she hadn't expected to feel. In the beginning, the affair had seemed harmless, a way to fill the loneliness she felt in her marriage. But now, faced with the raw betrayal in Harold's eyes, she realized the depth of the damage she had caused. It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice breaking. "Harold, I never meant to hurt you. I was lonely. You were always at work, always focused on everyone else but me. I didn't feel like I mattered to you anymore." Harold's jaw clenched, his gaze hardening. "So this is my fault?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You think that justifies betraying me? That gives you the right to lie to me, to make a fool out of me?" Clara looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She knew there was no excuse, no justification that would ease the pain she had caused. But part of her still felt a flicker of resentment. She had spent years feeling neglected, overlooked, as Harold poured his energy into his work, leaving her to navigate their marriage alone. Trey had offered her an escape, a way to feel alive again. And for a while, she had convinced herself that she deserved that happiness, even if it came at a cost. "I don't expect you to understand," Clara said quietly. "I know I hurt you. But I was hurting too, Harold. I was hurting for a long time." Harold shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "You were hurting. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To our marriage? You took everything I believed in, everything I trusted, and you destroyed it." For the first time, Clara saw tears glistening in his eyes, a glimpse of the pain that lay beneath his anger. She felt a pang of remorse, a hollow ache that resonated in her chest. She reached out, placing her hand on his arm, but he pulled away, his expression one of disgust. "Don't touch me," he muttered, his voice filled with contempt. "You don't get to comfort me, not after what you've done." Clara's hand fell to her side, her heart sinking as she realized the depth of the divide between them. She had known that the affair would hurt him, but she hadn't anticipated the full extent of his pain, the raw betrayal that she saw in his eyes. For a brief moment, she considered leaving, packing her bags and disappearing from his life. But a part of her still loved him, still clung to the life they had built together, even if it was fractured beyond repair. Over the next few days, Harold struggled to navigate the reality of his broken marriage. He avoided Clara as much as possible, spending long hours at the station or driving aimlessly around town, trying to escape the torment of his thoughts. His deputies noticed his erratic behavior, his uncharacteristic outbursts, but no one dared ask him what was wrong. He was the sheriff, after all, the man who kept order, who held everything together. But inside, Harold felt like he was unraveling, his sense of self crumbling beneath the weight of Clara's betrayal. He began drinking more heavily, using alcohol to numb the pain, to silence the thoughts that haunted him at night. The quiet of his home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, each room a reminder of the life he had lost. The pictures on the walls, the mementos of their life together, felt like mockeries, fragments of a love that had turned to ashes. One night, after too many drinks, Harold found himself staring at a photograph of him and Clara on their wedding day. They were young, hopeful, full of dreams and promises that now seemed hollow. He felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment that he couldn't contain. Without thinking, he grabbed the frame and hurled it across the room, watching as it shattered against the wall, the glass splintering into 1,000 pieces. The sound of the breaking glass echoed in the silence, a stark reminder of the destruction that had taken root in his life. He stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched as he stared at the broken photograph. The rage within him boiled over, and he found himself tearing through the house, ripping down photos, tossing furniture, anything to release the anger that consumed him. When he finally stopped, he was surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. The house was in shambles, the remnants of his life scattered across the floor. He felt a hollow satisfaction, a fleeting sense of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a wave of exhaustion. He sank to the floor, his shoulders slumped, as the weight of his grief settled over him like a heavy shroud. In that moment, Harold made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, consumed by anger and bitterness, trapped in a marriage that had become a prison. He needed closure, a way to move forward, even if it meant confronting the pain head-on. He decided to confront Clara one last time, to lay everything bare, to force her to see the destruction she had wrought. The next evening, Harold returned home, his mind steeled for the conversation ahead. Clara was in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. She looked up as he entered, a mixture of fear and resignation in her gaze. She knew that this was the end, that whatever thread had held their marriage together had finally snapped. "Harold," she began, her voice trembling. Don't," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "I'm not here for apologies or excuses. I just want to know. Why?" Clara's shoulders slumped, her expression one of defeat. She took a deep breath, struggling to find the words. "I don't know if I can explain it," she admitted. "I was lonely, Harold. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore. You were always gone, always wrapped up in your work. And Trey, he made me feel seen, important. I know it's wrong, but it was something I needed." Harold's face twisted with pain, her words cutting him deeper than any physical wound. "I gave everything to this marriage, Clara. I sacrificed my time, my life, for us, for this community. And this is how you repay me." Clara looked away, shame flickering across her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know how else to cope." Harold took a deep breath, his gaze hardening as he looked at her. "You don't get to apologize, Clara. You made your choices. You destroyed our marriage. And now, you have to live with that." With those words, Harold turned and walked out of the room, leaving Clara standing alone, her heart heavy with regret. As he left, he knew that there was no going back, no salvaging the life they had once shared. The marriage was over, a casualty of secrets, lies, and betrayal. But as he closed the door behind him, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the darkness in his life was far from over. "You said, continue with part 3 more unique and lengthy." ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 3. Shadows in the Past. Harold's days became a bleak routine of empty motions. His mornings started with coffee that had lost its taste, followed by shifts at the sheriff's office, where he went through the motions without his usual vigor. He barely spoke to his deputies, and when he did, his voice carried a clipped tone that kept them at a distance. The respect he had once earned from them was now mingled with an underlying tension. Harold had always been the quiet leader, the steady rock, but now he was visibly fraying at the edges, and they could sense it. At home, Clara's presence became unbearable. Though they occupied the same space, it felt like she was a ghost haunting the rooms they once shared. She tried a few times to break the silence, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, but Harold's stony responses made it clear he wasn't interested. The few words they exchanged were brief and practical, spoken out of necessity rather than any desire for connection. The marriage was a hollow shell now, and both knew it. On an evening in late autumn, with the trees outside stripped bare and the wind howling against the house, Harold found himself sifting through old family photo albums, images from a time when life seemed simpler, when he and Clara were happy. He flipped through page after page, his eyes scanning photos of birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries, each image a reminder of the life he thought he had. He paused at one photo of him and Clara on their 10th anniversary, holding each other with genuine smiles. He couldn't reconcile the woman in the photo with the one in the other room, the one who had betrayed him so thoroughly. He felt a strange pull, an urge to uncover the years between then and now, as if understanding the drift between them might bring him some closure. How had they gone from the couple in the photograph to two strangers caught in a web of lies and resentment? As he stared at the photo, a thought began to take root. He'd investigated hundreds of cases over his career, uncovering secrets, tracking down motives. Why should this be any different? The betrayal, the lies. It was his case now, one that demanded resolution. He decided he would investigate his own marriage, trace back the moments, the decisions, and the whispers that had led them to this breaking point. Harold's investigation began with the simplest of things: conversations with friends, neighbors, and even the staff at Lindell Construction, where Clara and Trey worked. He was careful, asking questions under the guise of friendly interest, never letting on that he was digging for information. What he learned, however, only deepened his sense of betrayal. It became evident that Clara and Trey's relationship had been more than just a passing affair. They had been together for years, with Trey attending social gatherings and work functions, as if he were part of Clara's life outside their home. As Harold pieced together more details, he realized that this betrayal had been right under his nose. People had seen them together, had whispered behind his back, but no one had fought to tell him. Either out of respect or fear, no one in the community dared to bring it up. The loyalty he had shown his town was returned with silence, a realization that cut him deeply. He felt anger, yes, but also a strange kind of shame. Was he so feared, so isolated, that people didn't feel they could come to him with the truth? Or was it pity, a silent agreement to spare him the pain? The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that his marriage had been the town's best-kept secret. And as he delved deeper, he found himself haunted by one question that he couldn't shake. Had Clara ever truly loved him, or was their entire life together a lie? One night, as Harold sat in the dim light of his living room, Clara entered the room, her face pale and tired. She looked as though she wanted to speak, as though words were on the edge of her lips, but she hesitated, her gaze lingering on the shattered picture frames Harold hadn't bothered to clean up. "I can't do this anymore, Harold," she finally whispered, her voice breaking the silence that had stretched between them for weeks. Harold didn't look up. He kept his gaze fixed on the glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid swirling as he tilted the glass. "Then leave," he replied, his tone cold. "Nothing's stopping you." Clara flinched, her face crumbling as she absorbed the impact of his words. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking again. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But we can't keep going on like this. It's killing both of us." He finally looked up, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "You think you can just walk away from this? From everything you've done? You destroyed this marriage, Clara. You ruined everything." Clara's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Harold thought he saw regret flicker in her eyes, a glimpse of the woman he had once loved. "I never wanted to hurt you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted you to know that." Harold set his glass down with a heavy sigh, his anger momentarily giving way to exhaustion. "Then why did you do it, Clara? Why betray me? Why him?" Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I was lonely, Harold," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were always so consumed with your work, with the town, with everyone but me. I needed someone who saw me, who made me feel alive. Trey gave me that. I know it was wrong, but I couldn't stop." Harold's jaw tightened, his fists clenching as he fought to keep his composure. He wanted to scream at her, to shake her, to make her understand the depth of his pain. But instead, he simply nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Then you should have left me. You should have had the decency to leave." Clara looked at him, her face etched with sorrow. "I know," she replied. "And maybe I would have. But I was afraid. Afraid of starting over, of losing everything we'd built. I thought I could keep it separate, that it wouldn't hurt you." Harold let out a bitter laugh, the sound filled with disbelief. "And how did that work out for you, Clara? Because you didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything. Everything." They fell into silence, the weight of their words settling heavily between them. For a brief moment, they were just two people, broken and weary, facing the consequences of their choices. But the peace was short-lived. The anger, the betrayal, the bitterness, it was all still there, festering like an open wound that refused to heal. Over the following days, Harold became obsessed with the idea of closure, though he wasn't quite sure what form it would take. He couldn't imagine reconciling with Clara, nor could he picture a future without her entirely. It was as if he were trapped in a limbo of his own making, unable to move forward or let go of the past. One evening, while reviewing his investigation notes at the station, he came across a new detail. Trey's alibi for a specific night several months earlier didn't add up. It had been a night when Clara had supposedly been away on a work trip. Trey had claimed to be out of town as well. But as Harold dug deeper, he discovered a discrepancy, a credit card charge at a local motel that same night, under Trey's name. A chill ran down Harold's spine as he realized the implications. He'd thought he knew the full extent of the affair, but this detail hinted at something more calculated, more deliberate. He began to wonder if there was another layer to their betrayal, a deeper deceit that had been concealed all along. Driven by a newfound resolve, Harold decided to pay Trey a visit once more. This time, he wasn't going for answers. He was going for the truth, for whatever was hidden beneath the surface of Trey's carefully constructed facade. Harold found Trey at a local bar, a place he frequented after work. The dimly lit establishment was mostly empty, save for a few regulars nursing their drinks in silence. Trey was seated at the far end of the bar, a beer in hand, his gaze distant and unfocused. He didn't notice Harold's approach until the sheriff was standing right beside him, his presence looming like a storm cloud. Trey looked up, his face paling as he registered Harold's expression. "Sheriff," he stammered, trying to mask his discomfort. What brings you here?" Harold's eyes were cold, his voice low and controlled. "We need to talk, Trey. And I suggest you don't lie to me." Trey swallowed, visibly unnerved. He glanced around, as if searching for an escape, but he knew there was none. Resigned, he gestured to an empty booth in the corner. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's talk." They sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. Harold wasted no time, his gaze fixed on Trey with an intensity that left no room for pretense. "I know you've been lying, Trey," Harold began, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of menace. "I know about the night at the motel. The night you and Clara were supposed to be out of town." Trey's face went pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to respond. I don't know what you're talking about." Harold's jaw tightened, his patience waning. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've looked into it. I have the records. Now, tell me the truth." Trey's composure crumbled, and he let out a shaky sigh, his gaze dropping to the table. "Fine," he admitted. "We were there, but it was just one night, one slip-up. It didn't mean anything." Harold leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You don't get to decide what means something, Trey. Not after everything you've done." Trey shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the bar. "Look, Sheriff, I'm sorry. I never meant for things to get this far. I never meant to hurt you." Harold's fists clenched, his voice cold and unyielding. "Don't pretend you care. You were selfish, Trey. You thought you could take what you wanted without any consequences. Well, there are consequences. and you're going to face them." As Harold stood to leave, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a glimmer of closure he hadn't expected. Trey was nothing more than a shadow, a reminder of a past that no longer held power over him. Harold knew that he still had a long way to go, that the wounds left by Clara's betrayal would take time to heal. But in that moment, he felt a sense of strength, a determination to reclaim his life, piece by piece. As he stepped out into the night, Harold felt the weight of the past lift, if only slightly. There were battles yet to be fought, truths yet to uncover, but he was ready. He would face whatever lay ahead, even if it meant walking through the shadows alone. Threads of deceit. The encounter with Trey left Harold with a strange clarity. Confronting Trey had purged some of the bitterness gnawing at him, but it hadn't provided the full closure he was hoping for. Deep inside, he knew this wasn't just about Trey, it was about Clara. Their history, their promises, their broken life together. Those were the wounds that cut deepest. Trey had simply been a symptom, a catalyst in a relationship that had been quietly deteriorating for years. In the following days, Harold began to revisit memories he had once pushed to the back of his mind, moments from his life with Clara that, in hindsight, seemed laden with hidden meanings. He recalled small fights, distant silences, instances where he had chosen his work over her, believing that his dedication to the town would make up for the time he couldn't give her. He had been so certain that his sacrifices were necessary, that they were for the greater good. But now he questioned everything. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his living room, Harold pulled out an old leather-bound journal that he hadn't opened in years. Clara had gifted it to him on their 5th wedding anniversary, urging him to write down his thoughts, his experiences as a sheriff, and to record the life they were building together. For years, he had filled the pages with his daily routines, moments he wanted to remember, small accomplishments, and reflections on his life. Flipping through those pages now, he saw glimpses of a man he barely recognized, a man who had believed wholeheartedly in his role, in his purpose, and in his marriage. Late one evening, as he sat alone in his living room, Harold pulled out an old leather-bound journal that he hadn't opened in years. Clara had gifted it to him on their 5th wedding anniversary, urging him to write down his thoughts, his experiences as a sheriff, and to record the life they were building together. For years, he had filled the pages with his daily routines, moments he wanted to remember, small accomplishments, and reflections on his life. Flipping through those pages now, he saw glimpses of a man he barely recognized, a man who had believed wholeheartedly in his role, in his purpose, and in his marriage. One entry, written shortly after their 10th anniversary, stood out. "Sometimes I wonder if Clara feels lonely. She doesn't say it, but I can see it in her eyes. I know I'm away too often, but she always tells me she understands, that she supports me. I don't deserve her kindness. I'll make it up to her one day." Harold's heart ached as he read his own words, the innocence and optimism in them like a distant echo of a life he could no longer reach. He had meant those words sincerely, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped making her a priority, convinced himself that she was fine, that she would always be there. The realization was as painful as it was humbling. Harold's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was late, and he wasn't expecting anyone. He stood, his body weary, and opened the door to find Detective Samuel Drury on his porch. Sam was a younger detective from the state's investigative unit who had worked with Harold on several high-profile cases over the years. They had a professional respect for each other, and Sam often looked to Harold as a mentor. "Evening, Sheriff," Sam greeted, his tone unusually reserved. "Sam," Harold replied, surprised. "What brings you here at this hour?" Sam shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering away for a moment before he spoke. There's something I think you should know. It's about Clara and Trey. I've been looking into some things." Harold's pulse quickened. "What things?" Sam hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Look, I know this is personal, and I didn't want to overstep, but I found something in Trey's background that you might want to see. It paints a very different picture." He handed Harold a manila folder, the edges worn as if it had been handled many times. Harold took it, his hand steady despite the turmoil inside him. He nodded to Sam, silently inviting him inside, and they moved to the living room, where Harold gestured for Sam to sit. Harold took a seat across from him, the folder resting on his lap, heavy with unspoken revelations. "Go on," Harold urged, his voice calm but his eyes intense. Sam leaned forward, his expression serious. "Trey isn't who he says he is. His employment records show inconsistencies, and there are gaps in his work history that he never disclosed. It appears he's moved from town to town, each time leaving under strange circumstances. And there's more. He has a record. Petty theft, fraud, and even a few charges related to deception in previous jobs." Harold's mind raced as he processed the information. This wasn't just an affair. It was a carefully orchestrated manipulation. Trey hadn't just charmed Clara. He had targeted her, used her loneliness and vulnerability as a way into her life, and by extension, into Harold's. "I don't think he's just some innocent coworker who got involved in an affair," Sam continued, his voice low. "There's a pattern here, a history of getting close to people and exploiting them. From what I've gathered, Trey's MO is to find people who have influence, who have resources, and then manipulate them." Harold's grip tightened on the folder, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Are you telling me he played her? That he got involved with her as some kind of con?" Sam nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying. He's done it before, Sheriff, and he was using Clara to get access to things he otherwise couldn't. I think he saw her loneliness, her position, and he used it to his advantage. And if he could compromise your position through her, all the better." The revelation hit Harold like a punch to the gut. Clara, despite her betrayal, was still the woman he had once loved, the woman he had trusted with everything. The thought that she had been manipulated, that her vulnerability had been exploited, shifted something in him. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it cast it in a different light. "What else?" Harold asked, his voice strained. "What else did you find?" Sam hesitated. "I have reason to believe he's planning something bigger. Clara's role at Lindell Construction gives her access to sensitive financial information, project bids, contracts. It's possible he's using her to get that information, and he might already be planning to move on, leaving her to take the fall if anything goes wrong." The pieces began to fall into place, and Harold's anger crystallized into a singular, determined purpose. Trey hadn't just seduced Clara. He had manipulated her, used her as a pawn in some twisted scheme. The betrayal was more insidious than he had imagined, a violation that extended beyond his marriage and into his very sense of justice. That night, Harold sat alone, the folder open in front of him, his mind racing with plans. He couldn't simply confront Trey and Clara again. This went deeper than personal betrayal. Trey was a criminal, a man who thrived on deception, and Harold knew that if he confronted him without evidence, Trey would simply slip away, leaving Clara and the town to deal with the aftermath. For the first time in his career, Harold decided to go off the books. He needed to handle this quietly, without alerting Trey to his intentions. He knew the risks, knew that if he got caught, it could ruin his career, but he didn't care. This was personal, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect his town, his reputation, and, ironically, Clara. The next morning, Harold began his own covert investigation, using contacts he had accumulated over his years in law enforcement to gather information on Trey's activities and movements. He reached out to colleagues in neighboring towns, old friends who owed him favors, and even former informants. Every scrap of information confirmed what Sam had told him. Trey was a con artist, a man who moved through people's lives like a virus, leaving destruction in his wake. But one discovery stood out among the rest. Trey had been meeting with a local businessman who had a reputation for shady dealings and questionable ethics. The businessman, Douglas Tate, owned several properties around Ellisville, and was rumored to be involved in under-the-table deals. Tate's connection to Trey suggested that the scheme was larger than Harold had initially realized. Days passed, and Harold's sleepless nights began to take their toll. He spent every waking hour piecing together the connections between Trey, Clara, and Tate, each new discovery adding to the twisted web of lies and manipulation. By the end of the week, he had built a timeline of Trey's activities, tracing his interactions with Tate, his movements around town, and his meetings with Clara. He kept all of this from Clara, avoiding her at home, refusing to let her see the extent of his knowledge. He didn't trust her, not fully, but a part of him wanted to believe that she hadn't known the full truth, that she hadn't willingly participated in Trey's scheme. Perhaps she had been blinded by her feelings, by the need to feel valued, and had allowed herself to be pulled into something she didn't understand. One night, as Harold sat in his office, poring over his notes, his phone buzzed with a message from Sam. "Got a lead. Tate and Trey are meeting at the Blackwood Inn tomorrow night. Thought you'd want to know." Harold's heart raced. This was it, the opportunity he had been waiting for. If he could catch them in the act, gather evidence of their dealings, he could bring both Trey and Tate to justice. But he needed to be careful, needed to ensure that he had undeniable proof. He spent the next day preparing, gathering the necessary recording equipment, and enlisting the help of a trusted deputy, Mark, who was one of the few people he trusted implicitly. Mark had known Harold for years and understood the gravity of the situation, agreeing to help him without question. As night fell, Harold and Mark positioned themselves outside the Blackwood Inn, concealed in an unmarked car with a clear view of the entrance. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last, until finally, Trey's car pulled up. He stepped out, his gaze darting around before he disappeared into the inn. Not long after, Tate arrived, his bulky frame casting a shadow under the dim lights. He strode inside with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Harold and Mark watched in silence, their recording equipment capturing every detail. Inside, Trey and Tate sat in a secluded corner of the inn's lounge, their voices low as they discussed their plans. Harold listened through the recording device, his jaw tightening as he heard Trey lay out his scheme, detailing how he had manipulated Clara, how he had used her access to Lindell Construction's finances to gather information for Tate's illicit deals. Harold's heart pounded as he recorded every word, his rage barely contained as he listened to Trey speak about Clara as if she were nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. This man had shattered his marriage, his life, and now he spoke about Clara with a callousness that made Harold's blood boil. But Harold forced himself to remain calm. He needed this evidence, needed every word to ensure that Trey and Tate would face justice. When the meeting ended, Trey and Tate left the inn, each going their separate ways. Harold and Mark followed Trey at a safe distance, tracking him as he returned to his apartment. Once they were certain he was alone, Harold made his move. He approached Trey's apartment, his steps steady, his face set in determination. He knocked on the door, and Trey opened it, his eyes widening in shock as he recognized Harold. What are you doing here?" Trey stammered, trying to mask his fear. Harold stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He took a deep breath, his voice cold and unyielding. "It's over, Trey. I know everything, and I've got the proof." Trey's face paled, his confidence crumbling as he realized the extent of Harold's knowledge. He tried to backtrack, to plead, but Harold silenced him with a single, steely glance. "This isn't just about Clara," Harold continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been using people, manipulating them for your own gain. But that ends tonight." Trey's shoulders slumped, his bravado vanishing as he realized he had no escape. He knew Harold wouldn't stop until justice was served, and he understood that his con had finally come to an end. As Harold left the apartment, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The betrayal still lingered, but he had taken the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming the life that Trey had tried to destroy. There was still much to be resolved, much to face, but Harold knew he would find a way forward. And as he walked into the night, he felt the weight of his past lifting, making room for the future he would now rebuild. The web tightens. The confrontation with Trey had given Harold a sense of satisfaction, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Trey might have realized the game was up, but Harold needed airtight evidence to bring both Trey and Tate down legally. He couldn't allow them to escape justice. His town, his family, and even Clara deserved more than empty threats. They deserved accountability. And Harold was going to make sure that they got it. That night, Harold barely slept. He lay awake, his mind racing with strategies, plans, and contingencies. He knew that Tate, with his network of powerful allies and his ability to stay hidden from scrutiny, would be the harder target. Tate was a businessman who kept his hands clean, always operating through proxies, hiding his dirty dealings behind layers of legality. Trey, in comparison, was a small fish. Exposing Tate's role in the scheme would be more challenging, but if Harold could connect the dots, it would dismantle the web of corruption that had taken root in his town. The next morning, Harold went to the sheriff's office with a renewed determination. His deputies noticed a change in him. The shadow that had been haunting his eyes seemed to have lifted, replaced by a fierce resolve. For the first time in weeks, he felt a semblance of his old self. This was his town, his people, and he wasn't going to let predators like Trey and Tate tear it apart. He called Deputy Mark into his office, closing the door behind him. Mark had been loyal for years, a steady presence in the office, and one of the few people Harold trusted implicitly. Mark knew about the affair, about Harold's plan to expose Trey and Tate, and his loyalty had never wavered. Harold was grateful for that, and he needed it now more than ever. "Mark," Harold began, his voice steady, "we're going to need a search warrant for Trey's apartment and for Tate's properties. I need you to talk to Judge McAllister, see if he'll sign off on it." Mark's brows furrowed, his tone cautious. "You think the judge will go for it? Tate's pretty well connected. This might stir up some trouble." Harold nodded, understanding the risks. "I know, but McAllister owes me a favor, and he's not a fan of Tate's. We need to act fast before Tate realizes we're onto him. The last thing we want is for them to cover their tracks." Mark gave a nod of understanding. "I'll see what I can do, Sheriff, but if this goes sideways, there could be backlash." Harold leaned forward, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "Let them come for me, Mark. I've dedicated my life to this town, and I won't let these men tear it apart. We do this by the book, but we do it right." "Understood." Mark gave a resolute nod, his loyalty unwavering. "Understood, Sheriff." With Mark handling the warrant, Harold knew his next step was to gather more concrete evidence, particularly around Tate's business dealings. He needed documentation, emails, bank transfers, anything that would prove Tate's involvement in illegal activities and tie him to Trey's manipulation of Clara. It was one thing to confront Trey face to face, but in a courtroom, he needed evidence that would speak louder than any accusations. That afternoon, Harold went back to Lindell Construction under the guise of a routine check-in. He wasn't sure how much Clara knew about Tate's involvement, but he needed answers. He hoped that Clara's position within the company might allow him access to records and information that could lead back to Tate. It was risky, involving her in any way, but he had little choice. When he arrived, Clara looked surprised to see him. Their interactions had been sparse since the confrontation, and this was the first time he had come to her workplace unannounced. She looked up from her desk, her expression a mixture of apprehension and confusion. "Harold, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tentative. Harold gave a small nod of greeting, keeping his tone neutral. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Clara's eyes flickered with unease, but she motioned for him to take a seat in her office. Once he was seated, Harold wasted no time, his voice low but firm. "Clara, I know Trey's been using you to access sensitive information here at Lindell. Financial records, contracts, anything that could benefit him and Tate." Clara's face paled, her hands trembling as she clasped them together on the desk. What? What are you talking about? I have reason to believe that Trey and Tate are working together, Harold continued, watching her reaction closely. Tate's been using Trey to get close to you, to gain access to financial data he can use for his own interests. It wasn't just an affair, Clara. You were being used. Clara's lips parted, her eyes filling with a mixture of shock and horror. For a moment, she was speechless, as if the weight of Harold's words were too much to process. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That can't be true. Trey. He wouldn't do that to me. Harold's jaw tightened, his gaze unwavering. I wish that were true. But Trey's been manipulating you from the start. He saw an opportunity in your position, your access, and he took it. I'm not here to judge you, Clara, but I need your help to bring them down. Clara's shoulders slumped, and Harold could see the devastation etched across her face. She had trusted Trey, confided in him, even loved him in her own way, but now she was confronted with the ugly reality that her vulnerability had been exploited, her love used as a weapon against her. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly brushed them away, her voice barely a whisper. What do you need from me? Harold leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. I need access to any records Tate might have requested through Trey. Anything unusual that might show a financial connection between Tate's operations and Lindell Construction. Can you do that? Clara nodded, swallowing hard as she composed herself. Yes, I can get you access to the files. But Harold, I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. For a brief moment, Harold saw the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the one who had stood by him, who had been his partner in life, long before things had fallen apart. Her regret was palpable, and for the first time since the betrayal, he felt a flicker of sympathy. But he couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment. There was too much at stake. Thank you, he replied, his voice soft. This isn't just about us, Clara. It's about doing what's right for this town, for everyone Trey and Tate have hurt. Clara gave a small nod, her expression resolute despite the pain in her eyes. I'll get the files for you by tomorrow. The following day, Clara handed over a stack of documents, her face set with grim determination. Harold took them, grateful for her cooperation, but wary of the emotions that simmered between them. They shared a brief, wordless exchange, an acknowledgement of the broken trust between them, but also a shared understanding that this was bigger than both of them. Back at the office, Harold pored over the documents with Mark by his side. As they sifted through financial records, contracts, and email correspondences, a pattern began to emerge, a series of subtle yet suspicious transactions that linked Tate's properties to shell companies associated with Lindell Construction. The transactions were cleverly disguised, but the amounts were just enough to raise red flags, suggesting kickbacks and illegal bids. Look at this, Mark pointed to a particular document, his eyes narrowing. Tate's company paid out bonuses to several contractors under Lindell's payroll, but the amounts don't match any project work listed in the logs. They're paying for something else. Harold's eyes narrowed as he examined the document. The payments were scattered across several months, with each contractor receiving just enough to evade suspicion. But when taken together, the amounts were significant. It was clear that Tate had been using Lindell's resources to funnel money into his own operations, and Trey had likely been the middleman, feeding Tate information through Clara. We've got him, Harold said, a sense of triumph swelling in his chest. We have the transactions, the connections, and the motive. All we need now is to set the trap. Mark grinned, his respect for Harold evident. What's the plan? Harold leaned back, his mind racing with possibilities. We're going to set up a sting. Tate doesn't know we're onto him yet, and I want to catch him in the act. If we can get him and Trey talking about their operation, we'll have everything we need to put them away. Mark nodded, his expression serious. Let's do it. The following evening, Harold arranged for Clara to meet with Trey under the pretense of a final business meeting at one of Tate's properties, a property under surveillance, with hidden cameras and recording devices set up by Harold and his team. Clara had agreed to cooperate, her guilt and sense of duty compelling her to help bring Trey down, even if it meant facing the man who had betrayed her. Harold watched from a hidden room nearby, the video feed capturing every angle of the room where Trey and Clara sat. He saw the tension on Clara's face, the way her hands fidgeted nervously, but he also saw her resolve. The final reckoning. Harold watched the live video feed intently, his jaw clenched, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the table. The room was cold and silent, save for the faint hum of the surveillance equipment. Next to him, Deputy Mark monitored the audio, ensuring every word between Clara and Trey was being recorded. This was it, the culmination of weeks of work, sleepless nights, and the harrowing realization of betrayal. Tonight, he would see justice served. On the screen, Clara sat across from Trey in one of Tate's secluded properties, a small office space on the outskirts of town. She looked tense, her fingers intertwined tightly on her lap, but she maintained a steady gaze. Trey, in contrast, appeared relaxed, leaning back in his chair with a smirk on his face, clearly unaware of the setup. "I'm glad you came," Trey began, his tone smooth and practiced, the same charm he'd used to lure Clara into his schemes. "I know things have been difficult with Harold, but once we finish this, we can finally move on. Just you and me." Clara's jaw tightened, and Harold noticed the flicker of resentment in her eyes, though she hid it well. She took a steadying breath, her voice calm. "Trey, I need to understand something. What exactly are we doing here? You've been vague about the details, and I need to know what I'm putting myself at risk for." Trey chuckled, leaning forward. "Clara, you don't have to worry about the details. All you need to do is keep providing me with access to Lindell's financial records and project bids. Tate handles the rest. The money we make will be enough for us to live comfortably for a long time." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "And what about Harold?" Trey shrugged nonchalantly, his gaze dismissive. "Harold's a relic, stuck in his old ways. Once we're out of here, he'll be none the wiser. By the time he realizes what's happened, we'll be long gone. You deserve better, Clara. You don't need to be tied down by him, by this town." Harold's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles white. He had prepared himself for this, had known that Trey would speak about him with disdain, but hearing it so directly, seeing the man's utter disregard for the destruction he'd caused, ignited a fresh wave of anger within him. Clara's voice, steady but with an edge of vulnerability, cut through his thoughts. "I thought you loved me, Trey. I thought this was more than just a scheme for you." Trey's smirk faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "Of course I care about you, Clara, but we both know this is about more than just feelings. It's about building a future, a life that isn't restricted by this town or by people who don't understand us." Clara swallowed, her face betraying a mix of anger and sadness. "So it's all about the money for you, isn't it? Using me, using my access, using everything we shared." Trey's mask slipped, and for the first time, Harold saw a glimpse of the man's true nature. A manipulator, devoid of empathy, viewing people as mere tools to be used and discarded. Trey leaned in, his tone turning cold. "Look, Clara, don't start getting sentimental on me now. We've come too far. You knew what this was. Don't pretend otherwise." In the surveillance room, Harold felt his pulse quicken. Clara was doing her part, drawing Trey out, leading him to expose the depths of his deception. But they needed more. They needed Trey to admit to his collusion with Tate directly. After a tense silence, Clara cleared her throat, forcing herself to maintain control. "What about Tate? He's the one who's really pulling the strings here, isn't he?" Trey nodded, a sly smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, Tate's the brains behind this. I'm just the middleman. He's been wanting to expand his operation, and with Lindell's contracts, he can leverage his influence in other counties. You're giving him access to things he couldn't get otherwise. Clara pressed further, her voice soft but insistent. And what's his plan? I need to know what I'm walking into if we're going to do this together. Trey sighed, rolling his eyes slightly, but he relented, clearly eager to impress her with the scheme's scope. Fine. Tate's got a network. He's been funneling money through shell companies, using Lindell's construction projects as fronts. He's laundering his profits and securing government contracts. You, Clara, were the perfect way in. Harold exchanged a look with Mark, who gave him a quick nod. This was the evidence they needed, the connection between Tate's illegal activities and Trey's manipulation of Clara to gain access to Lindell's contracts. It was enough to arrest both Trey and Tate, to expose the corruption that had festered in the town's shadows. Harold leaned toward the microphone connected to Clara's earpiece, his voice calm and steady. Clara, you've done well. Just a little more. Ask him about his plans for leaving town. Clara gave a barely perceptible nod, her voice carrying a hint of desperation as she spoke. Trey, what's our plan for getting out of here? Once this is done, where do we go? Trey's eyes gleamed with excitement, as if he could already taste the freedom he was chasing. We'll leave as soon as Tate closes the last deal. A quick trip down to the coast. Then we're off. I've got contacts in Mexico who can help us disappear. You won't have to worry about a thing, Clara. Just follow my lead. The cold certainty in his voice, the calculated ease with which he spoke of abandoning everything, sent a shiver through Harold. But it was also the final piece of evidence they needed. He reached for his radio, signaling to the officers positioned outside. All units, move in, he ordered, his voice laced with resolve. Secure both Trey and Tate. This ends tonight. Within moments, the quiet of the office erupted into chaos. Officers poured into the room, surrounding Trey and Clara. Trey's face twisted in shock as he realized what was happening, his eyes darting between Clara and the officers, betrayal flickering in his gaze. What the, Clara? You set me up. He snarled, his voice filled with fury. Clara's expression was resolute, a mix of relief and sadness. I did what I had to, Trey. I may have been blind before, but I won't let you destroy everything I have left. Before Trey could react further, two officers grabbed his arms, securing him in handcuffs. He struggled, his face twisted in rage, but it was clear that his fight was over. Tate, who had been apprehended in a nearby office, was dragged out as well, his face pale as he realized the extent of his downfall. Harold stepped into the room, his gaze hard as he looked at Trey and Tate, both men now subdued and cornered. He felt a sense of vindication, a justice that had been long overdue. This town trusted you, he said, his voice low but filled with authority, and you took advantage of that trust. You thought you could manipulate us, use our people, exploit our resources. But that ends here. Trey sneered, his voice dripping with bitterness. You think this changes anything, Sheriff? People like you are all the same. You think you're heroes, but you're just as weak as everyone else. Harold's gaze didn't waver. Maybe, but at least I can say I did what was right. With that, he signaled for the officers to take Trey and Tate away. As they were led out of the building, Harold turned to Clara, who stood silently, watching the man she had once trusted disappear into the night. After the arrests, Harold and Clara stood alone in the dimly lit office. The weight of the past few weeks hung heavy between them, an invisible barrier that neither knew how to cross. Clara finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, Harold. For everything. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I was in control, that I knew what I was doing. But I was wrong. Harold looked at her, his face softening for the first time in weeks. The anger, the betrayal, the resentment, all of it was still there, but it was tempered by a strange sense of closure. He had loved her once, deeply, and that love hadn't disappeared, even if it had been tarnished by betrayal. I know, Clara, he replied quietly. We both made mistakes. We both lost our way. She looked down, her shoulders slumping as the reality of their broken marriage settled over her. Do you think there's any chance for us to fix this?" Harold was silent for a long moment, weighing his words. He thought of the years they had shared, the memories they had built, the dreams they had once held. But he also knew that some things, once broken, could never be fully mended. "I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if we can go back. But maybe we can find a way forward, whatever that means." Clara nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes, tempered by the knowledge that their journey would be a difficult one. They might never find their way back to what they once had, but perhaps with time, they could find a way to coexist, to heal, even if that meant walking separate paths. As Harold left the building, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The storm had passed, leaving scars that would remain, but also a sense of closure. He had faced betrayal, exposed corruption, and fought for justice, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of himself that he thought he had lost. The road ahead was uncertain, and the wounds would take time to heal, but Harold knew he was ready. Whatever the future held, he would face it with the same determination that had carried him through this trial. And as he walked into the quiet of the night, he felt the first stirrings of hope, a new beginning, born from the ashes of the past.